Hi guys, I'm Dr. John. Welcome back to Shooting Up in the Dark, where we discuss all things related to addiction. Today we have a question sent to me: how do addicts in active addiction think or process? Well, I think that's a really fascinating question, and I just want to say a couple of things to begin. Number one, there are addicts from every walk of life, background, race, gender, all over this world. And so anyone can become an addict regardless of life circumstance. Um, but all of these people are unique. When it comes to addiction, though, the whole range of diversity in people do share certain dynamics of behavior and patterns that can be recognized as the same when it comes to addiction, behavior around addiction. So I do think there is a way that active addicts tend to think, and I'm going to go ahead and present that. Also, this is one video, and there's a whole group of videos here. And one of the main purposes is to educate all of us about addiction. So don't take this one video in isolation, just by itself. I recommend that you listen to several, including the introduction, if you want to, so you have more context and knowledge in which to place what I'm saying. So off the top of my head, here are characteristics of thinking and thought patterns of people who are in active addiction. Number one, irrationality. So many addicts still have, especially early in addiction, astute minds. They can be intelligent, perform tasks. They don't have much insight and tend to be irrational, though, regarding their own addiction. They could be type A, very logical, analytical people. They might be able to solve the Rubik's Cube in 1 minute or be a master chess player. But when it comes to arguments about whether or not they are addicted or whether they have a problem, they cannot be convinced by rational argument. Part of this is fear, a lot of it is, and also they believe they are unique. Most people in addiction have a stereotypical image of what addiction is, and if the person addicted doesn't fit that stereotype in his own mind, he will sustain the contention that he's not an addict. So by comparing himself or herself to others and differentiating himself or herself, the person identifies out. It's common for people in early recovery, when they attend meetings or in a treatment center for 30, 60 days, to have this belief that they're somehow different from everyone else, and somehow the rules of addiction don't apply to them, they don't belong in the recovery environment. And I'll admit to being guilty of this before my own addiction. When I was ignorant, I was probably already in addiction, but wouldn't admit it. I would compare myself to others, and I would say, well, for example, I'm not using a needle, I've never been in prison, I only take pills, I'm holding a job, I'm in healthy condition, and therefore there's no way I can be an addict, because an addict is a homeless person living on the street, injecting heroin and prostituting himself. A lot of addicts are in that stereotypical situation, but 20 years prior may have been a very successful person with all kinds of responsibilities. There is such thing as a functional addict, a person who does meet criteria for addiction. It's usually very early in the addiction, and they can still perform most of their roles and responsibilities. But if they keep using the drug, addiction always progresses, and they will never be able to sustain a normal life. Her life will continue to shrink, become more difficult, painful, conflictual. That's just the dynamic of addiction. Addicts can also be irrational in the sense that they are blind to consequences. After experiencing some really negative consequences directly as a result of their addiction, the addict will nevertheless repeat the same behavior and expect a different result, and think that somehow they're not subject to cause and effect like the rest of the universe. Let's shift gears for a minute and review why addicts have such deranged thinking. You have to remember that addiction is a mental health disorder. It's a form of insanity, literally. As described in other videos, the brain is hijacked by the drug, and continued use is driven by the survival instinct. The brain has been reinforced by massive surges of dopamine released with each hit of the drug that overwhelm the reward and pleasure circuitry. They motivate repeated behavior. And on the flip side, the profoundly negative experience of withdrawal and craving is strong negative enforcement for not using. If you wish, I suggest the videos describing the myth of addiction being a choice. Another characteristic of addictive thinking is dualism. In other words, thinking in which there's me and there's the rest of you. And taking that to an extreme. So I have no connections, I'm disconnected, no connection to a purchase, spirituality, God, any sense of oneness that I may have had before with nature, with God, etc., disappears. So the person has a belief in the transcendent, whether that's God or Christ, being, or the universe or whatever. There's a spiritual disconnection where that transcendence is muted. Also, the world seems to shrink into a tiny space like a coffin just around the addict. And the outside world, including other people, organizations, institutions, events, are perceived as either irrelevant or as a threat. So thoughts that go along with this are, I'm not a part of anything, no one cares about me, I have no meaningful connections, I'm not loved or protected, I'm just all by myself. Okay, then the next characteristic of active thinking of active drug users is obsession. Continual pressured thinking about obtaining and using more drug, which won't stop. Some have the luxury of having an unending supply of drugs so they can afford, they don't struggle to get enough. But most eventually are preoccupied and obsessed with how they will feel once the current dose wears off and doing whatever is necessary to get the next fix. So they're planning and scheming how to borrow, beg, steal, or earn money for that next fix. Resources are drained. Many will panhandle or sell their body for drugs or cash. So a lot of activity is around avoiding the law, other people who are seen as threats, finding money to buy and use, and avoiding facing withdrawal. An addict's thinking is narrowly focused in terms of it's around immediate gratification, immediate need, so only the now and getting to the next hit or fix is real. The rest of the world, reality, people, relationships, unfortunately become less and less real, and the addict can't face them. So they're stuck in the present and near future in fear around their addiction and do little to no long-term planning. The typical thought is, if I can just get enough, I would be okay. But there's never enough, of course. And over time, the focus becomes more and more on the drug and behaviors around that, and less focused on anything else, family, relationships, parenting, jobs, etc. The active addict also tends to have very self-centered thinking, and this manifests in a variety of ways. In addiction, addicts are very narcissistic, so everything is about me. I see everything through the lens of addiction, you, famous people, government, politics, working, parenting, health, you name it. Everything is seen more and more through the lens of addiction. And unfortunately, the addict will be willing to hurt or abuse or abandon themselves, but also others, if anything is in the way of the addiction. And the saddest manifestations of this I've seen is parents who can't take care of their children because they choose the pursuit of drugs ahead of that. There's a disinclination to travel, to be anywhere away from contact with their source, and they can become very attached to their particular life story, often a victimization narrative. They may be attached to or identified with their victimization or the trauma that's been through, and that's not to deny or minimize the seriousness of that, but it becomes very much a focus. They're very attached to their life story, and often they create a story of them being bad, them being unlovable, a bad child, a bad parent, a bad student, worthless, just generally unwanted. So feelings of shame, self-hate, regret, especially around parenting and kids, and letting loved ones down is very common for addicts. There may be a veneer of some confidence, but perhaps it's blunted when they're high on the drug. But addicts tend to have very low self-esteem and condemn themselves. That's why they don't need any further condemnation from us or you. Life is viewed basically as just this current circumstance, surviving now, and what I'm going to do next to use. And there are often premonitions of all the terrible consequences and outcomes possible as a result of his or her addiction. Jail, violence, death, abandonment, and ultimately just annihilation and being alone. Another obvious one is worry and panic. The addict tends to be very protective, feels vulnerable, already guilty and condemned, so will obsessively worry about potential scenarios and bad outcomes. And sometimes feelings are simply overwhelming when they get a glimpse of all the chaos and suffering and pain and dysfunction they've created and how stuck they are, and can see in a moment of clarity all they've lost and how they've harmed people. There could be a sense of overwhelm in which they don't think much at all. They're just reacting. Another characteristic of thinking and active addiction is fatalism or cynicism. Often the addict will be thinking to themselves, I wish I could quit, but I can't. There's no way to win this game. I'm ultimately trapped. And they're right that they're ultimately trapped if they're not going to accept help with detox and treatment and recovery. They may refuse help, believing that they're a lifer, quote unquote, that they'll never be able to embrace recovery. Recovery isn't for them. It's really a resignation, believing the lie that they have but two choices, using or death. And to be fair, it feels that way. If you're interacting with a person in active addiction and they're currently high or the drug is currently functioning on their brain, you may notice a lot of things. I mean, slowed speech, slow cognition, or psychiatric symptoms. There are so many different drugs. I've been speaking mainly about opioids, but there are stimulants like methamphetamine, cocaine, can also be associated with a type of mania, or even psychosis. So all kinds of delusions, false beliefs, swinging of mood, back and forth, loss of some of the originality of their personality, may become deeply paranoid, hallucinate even, or become preoccupied with paranoid delusions. So a hopeful sign is that there are moments of clarity in an addict's thinking, usually when they're coming down off the drug, where they will have some insight into the wreckage of their life. They'll see the different parts of their lives and what's been lost, what others have suffered because of them. And in those moments, they feel deep regret and sadness and a lot of fear. For a moment, they realize that changing is mandatory or things will get worse or that they will die. And all of the emotional pain, the mental pain and suffering, including the existential pain referred to elsewhere, starts to resurface in even worse form and in an exaggerated form once the effect of the drug starts wearing off. So they begin to see some reality, which could be a good thing, but unfortunately those feelings and realizations are often so completely overwhelming and terrifying to the addict that they just plunge back into using their next dose because they can't take the mental pain or emotional pain of those realizations. On the flip side, this moment of clarity may provide an opportunity for where the addict is more open than usual to intervention or to talking or going to a meeting or some kind of course in change or direction. And even if they don't change immediately, I believe that these moments of clarity plant seeds in the addict's mind, seeds of the truth that they are slowly killing themselves and that they can actually stop using. So that's what I have to say right now about how addicts and addiction think. If I think of any more, I'll make a second part. But thank you so much, and I look forward to talking to you again very soon.